TDS event towers are exclusive towers obtained from limited time events. Some of these towers are really rare, while some are pretty common. Once an event ends, the tower obtained from it can only be gotten from limited time Game Pass sales. There are currently 14 event towers, with some being worse and others being better. So in this video, I'll be going over all of them from worst to best while looking at their usage and some stats. Before we start, please like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, as I'd greatly appreciate it. First off, we have the Commando. The Commando was obtained from the 2019 Area 51 event, and it has never been sold as a Game Pass, which makes it the rarest tower in the game. However, despite it being rare, it really sucks. It costs 1.6 thousand to place for 4 DPS, that is absolutely horrible. However, at level 2 it does get explosives which fly into the air and strike the zombies, but they do 1 damage. At max level for a total cost of 22,000 it does 11 damage per rocket and has only 50 DPS, not to mention it has no hidden detection even though it has golden futuristic armor. Generally, the Commando sucks even when you spam it, so it's just not worth using at all. The only usage for this tower is to brag with because of how rare it is, but if you bring this tower you're basically wasting a tower slot. But with that being said, I didn't want to spend much time on this tower, so I've given it the 14th spot in this ranking. Now we have the Swarmer. The Swarmer was obtained from the 2020 spring event on hard mode. It was sold once as a Game Pass and that was during the event itself, so this is the second rarest tower in the game. The Swarmer deals damage over time with its bees. It throws them on enemies and they sting the enemies for a certain amount of time, dealing damage just like Cryomancer's burning. On level 4, the Swarmer gets a beehive grenade, making it able to deal splash damage. However, the problem with Swarmer is how low its DPS is. On level 0, it deals 2 DPS for $300, which may seem good, but the later levels aren't that great. It has 24 DPS for a total cost of 7,000 at max level. This is not that good, seeing as the bees cannot stack. The Swarmer used to be able to stack bees on enemies with the bee grenade, but that got removed, which is what made it so bad. But with that being said, this tower is somewhat usable in the early game and is pretty cheap, so it has some uses at least. So that's why I'm giving it the 13th spot in this ranking. Next up, we have the Archer. The Archer was obtained from the 2019 Christmas event via the Gift of Sharpness. It was last sold as a Game Pass over a year ago. The Archer deals damage with its arrows that actually have piercing, so maps with strafe paths it could perform really good. On level 3 it gains flaming arrows, so enemies now take burn damage, but for some reason the flames aren't visible. On max level the fire deals 80 damage in the span of 8 seconds, which is alright but not too useful. And unlike the last 2 towers, the Archer has hidden detection. However, the problem with Archer is that it is balanced to be only good if it pierces a lot of enemies. This makes the Archer extremely map reliant, and because of how garbage its single target DPS is, nobody uses it. Because of how situational the Archer tower is, I'm giving it the 12th spot in this ranking. Next up, we have the Gladiator. The Gladiator was obtained from the 2019 Sword Fights on the Heights event. It has been sold 7 times, most recently 6 months ago. The Gladiator is a melee tower, having short range but able to hit multiple enemies. It's also decently cheap, so it works as early and mid-game defense. On level 3, it gains an ability which makes swing rate faster by 35% for a few seconds. The Gladiator also has a passive ability to block stuns. However, the Gladiator has a bunch of weaknesses. It has a hit limit of 3, meaning that each swing cannot hit every enemy in its range. Whenever you use the ability, the Gladiator stalls for a few seconds, which can make it leak easily. And the parry has a cooldown of a few seconds, which makes it weak to enemies like the Fallen King, which stun more than once. The Gladiator isn't nearly as good as it was before and has been outclassed by a lot of towers, so I'm giving it the 11th spot in this ranking. Next up, we have the Sledger. The Sledger was obtained from the 2021 Frost Invasion event. It was last on sale 3 months ago. The Sledger is another melee tower. It applies chill onto enemies on impact, which makes them slower. On level 3, the Sledger now freezes enemies when they reach max chill, which in this case is after 2 hits. On level 4, it now deals double damage when it hits an enemy that is frozen, which can be pretty handy for tanky enemies. With all of that, however, because the sledger has such short range, it has a lot of disadvantages. While the stalling is useful, before level 5 it is pretty difficult to hit the same enemy twice due to the sledger not being able to hit multiple enemies easily. In games like Fallen, there's a lot of enemies with freeze immunity as well, so those enemies will bait the sledger into not hitting the ones without it. And the sledger is also really expensive for what it is, costing a total of 37,000 to max out. With that being said, there are better stalling towers than the sledger, so I'm giving it the 10th spot in this ranking. Next up, we have the Toxic Gunner. The Toxic Gunner was obtained from the 2020 Halloween event. It was last sold a year ago. The Toxic Gunner attacks both with its bullets and poison damage. After level 2, zombies now take poison damage after being shot. It works exactly like the Cryomancer burning, but it also drops defense. Each shot also slows down enemies by 4% and it stacks up to 20%. However, it's for a very short amount of time. At max level though, because it doesn't shoot in bursts anymore, it can be easier to stack slowness and apply poisoning to enemies by setting it to random. With all of that though, the Toxic Gunner has very low DPS output, sitting at 50 DPS at max level with 100 total poison damage, which isn't great at all. Even if it is cheap to max out at $14,000, you're better off just using Cryomancer instead of this for the defense melt, seeing as the slowdown isn't noticeable. With that being said though, this tower isn't anything too crazy, so I'm giving it the 9th spot in this ranking. Next up, we have the Hallow Punk. The Hallow Punk is obtained from the 2024 Hexscape event on easy mode and is currently obtainable. She attacks with a rocket launcher which knocks back enemies. After level 3, she now sets enemies on fire as well, just like the Cryomancer. This tower, as a matter of fact, only has 3 levels, so it's pretty unique. With that, she is really cheap and somewhat good for the early game, so that's pretty nice. However, because of this and that she's a beginner tower, her DPS is really low, sitting at 28 DPS. While the knockback is pretty useful, it falls off pretty quickly. With all of that being said though, this tower is fairly decent for a tower that everybody can get, so I'm giving it the 8th spot in this ranking. Next up, we have the Harvester. The Harvester is also obtained from the 2024 Hexscape event, but on hard mode, and is currently obtainable. She shoots with a crossbow, having piercing just like the Archer. However, she also has an ability which summons veins from the ground, slowing down enemies and dealing damage. As you upgrade her, the veins will deal more damage and slow down more. One thing about them though is if you place farms in her range, those farms will also summon veins on the path when you use the ability, but they will have half of the statistics of the ones from the Harvester herself. Even with all of that though, the Harvester is super expensive, having awful DPS even if you take advantage of her piercing, costing 37,000 for 60 DPS. For a tower this difficult to get, I think she deserves better, but I gotta give credit to the really cool design. With that being said, I'm giving her the 7th spot in this ranking. Next up, we have the Elf Camp. The Elf Camp was obtained via the 2022 Vine at Night event. It was last on sale almost a year ago. The Elf Camp is a spawner tower. It spawns multiple elves on the path which attack the enemies. These elves are Elf, Snowball Elf, Bomber Elf, Guardian Elf, Cannoneer Elves, Gift Bomber, Gunner Elves, and Ripped Elf. At the start it's only the regular elf that spawns, but as you upgrade the elf camp, the more elves start to spawn. The elf camp tower is extremely cheap, sitting at 15,000 to max out, making it really affordable. But you have to note that the units have extremely low DPS due to this, and it only has a placement limit of 2. But to make up for this, the elves spawn super often, and most of the time the map is filled with them even if it's short. With that being said though, I love using this tower and it's super good and fun, so I'm giving it the 6th spot in this ranking. Next up, we have the Slasher. The Slasher was obtained via the 2019 Halloween event and it is currently on sale. The Slasher attacks with its knife and every third hit deals multiplied damage, but the multiplication depends on the level. After level 2, the Slasher now deals bleed damage after hitting an enemy. The bleed works exactly like the Cryomancer burn damage, but the damage on the bleed depends on how much health the enemy has. This makes it good on bosses because they always have a lot of health. Once an enemy hits 30 bleed stack, all of the bleed damage applies at once. However, the slasher costs 31,000 to max out, which is really much for what it is. It does deal 236 DPS, but its single target damage because of its short range is pretty bad if you don't have a lot of them. With that being said, this tower is still pretty good, so I'm giving it the 5th spot in this ranking. Next up, we have the Executioner. The Executioner was obtained from the 2021 Solar Eclipse event and was last on sale a year ago. It attacks by throwing its axe, which hits multiple enemies and deals splash damage. The Executioner has a unique mechanic where its axe bounces between enemies, but it works best if you set its targeting to furthest. The Executioner also has flying detection, which can make it an option for flying enemies. But its DPS is also really low at max level, sitting at 40 DPS for $22,000. But the reason I put it here is because it does still perform pretty well because of the bounce, and its flying detection can come in pretty handy. It also has a bug you can do which makes it deal a lot more damage to enemies by placing it next to the path, but this is somewhat hard to pull off. But despite its garbage cost and DPS, it still manages to perform good on multiple occasions, so I'm giving it the 4th spot in this ranking. Next up, we have the Jester. The Jester was obtained from the 2023 Lunar Overture event and is currently on sale. It attacks with its bombs, which mostly provide support. As you upgrade it, the Jester gains more bombs. Those bombs are the Fire Bomb, which sets enemies on fire, the Ice Bomb, which applies the chill effect, the Poison Bomb, which lowers defense with a puddle and deals damage, and the Confusion Bomb, which makes enemies go back on the track for a few seconds. Now, the spotlight on the Jester really is the Confusion Bomb. This bomb is really good for crowds paired with the Ice or Poison Bomb, providing insane support for your DPS. This tower also works for the early game with the Fire Bomb, but it's mainly used for the Confusion Bomb. Not to mention how incredibly cheap to max out a Jester is, being $11,000 in total. With that being said, I think this tower is amazing a lot of times for support, so I'm giving it the 3rd spot in this ranking. Next up, we have the Cryomancer. The Cryomancer was obtained from the 2023 Krampus Revenge event. It was last on sale during that event. She is very similar to the Pyromancer, using a freeze ray that pierces multiple enemies and applies the chill effect, which slows down up to 50%. At max level, she also freezes enemies which reach max chill, and the slowness is now 75%. Now, while her 20 DPS isn't great, the reason I put her here is because of her stalling. Because she's like a Pyromancer piercing enemies, she is amazing for crowd control to help out your DPS. The 75% slowdown paired with the freeze is extremely good a lot of times. But the Cryomancer is able to handle more enemies than the Jester at once, which in my opinion makes her better. She is also super cheap to max out, costing 14,000 for max level in total. However, one problem with her is that she has no hidden detection. But I don't have much to complain about this tower. It has amazing crowd control, so I'm giving it the 2nd spot in this ranking. Last but not least, we have the Frost Blaster. The Frost Blaster was obtained from the 2019 Christmas event. It was last on sale 10 months ago. It attacks with a freeze ray, which instantly freezes enemies upon impact, also having piercing. At later levels, the freeze time becomes longer and the damage increases. The Frost Blaster also melts defense by 33%, which is really good. But the main obvious reason as to why it's here is because of the insta-freeze. The stalling with it is amazing, also slowing down enemies by 30% after being frozen. The Frost Blaster is also usable for the early game. While its DPS isn't a lot, it's the freezing that lets it deal a lot of damage. It also has hidden detection, lead detection, and insane range at max level. The only complaint I have about this tower is that the fire rate becomes slower at max level compared to level 3, so it's best to use level 3 until the late game. With that being said, this tower is amazing for stalling enemies and is crazy and hardcore, so I'm giving it the 1st spot in this ranking. Anyways, that's it for this video. If you enjoyed, please like and subscribe, and feel free to leave a comment down below. With that being said, have a good one.